Well, this evening we will be dealing with the last of the four discipleship parables that we've been looking at. This one is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 14. And there's actually two very brief parables, one right after the other. I'm going to back up a couple verses and read from Luke 14 verses 25 through 34 to put these parables in a little bit broader context. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." In these first three verses, 25 through 27, Luke repeats a statement that Jesus made on discipleship, at least in part, on 7 different occasions in the Gospels. This idea of renouncing even our most intimate family relationships as the price for discipleship. Luke is particularly concerned with discipleship throughout the meat of his gospel, toward the end of chapter 9 through chapter 19. This is a section that's referred to as a travel narrative, where it recounts Jesus' travels throughout Galilee and Judea. And discipleship is the ongoing theme throughout that passage. These two parables, verses 28 through 30 and verses 31 and 32, are parallel, but they're not quite identical. Both ask about a hypothetical situation. And in each, the focus is on analyzing the resources available to accomplish a specific task, and the focus on the consequences if the resources are not sufficient. The first engages the reader directly. The second is less personal, but the stakes are higher. If a builder fails, he alone bears the brunt of the failure. If a king fails in planning a war, many people can die or be, in the ancient world, forced into slavery. The focus in both of these, in fact this whole section, is on the idea of being able. The question implied is, what makes one able to be a disciple? What does it take? What do we have to have if we're to be successful in following Jesus? With the tower builder, the focal point is on the idea of completion. If you're going to set out to do something, you have to have the resources to see it through to its completion. And this is critical. Jesus had a lot of people who followed him for a while. He had a lot of hangers-on. He drew huge crowds of people at points. And some of them would be really excited and impressed with what Jesus had to say. And they'd want to be close. They'd want to take in every word. And they'd follow him for a while from village to village. And then the bloom kind of came off the rose. Either the demands of life drew their attention back to whatever it was they had left when they started following Jesus, or in some cases, as they listened more closely to what he had to say, they found themselves saying, this is pretty hard. What he's asking, I'm not sure I'm ready to give. There's a lot of things in life where we think we're really excited about doing something, and we jump in, and then what it really involves kind of comes home to us, and we discover, this isn't as much fun as I thought it was going to be. I remember in my very first semester of college, as a freshman at Baylor, I had signed up for Introduction to Greek 101.
Oh, gee.
And I was excited about the idea of being able to translate the New Testament for myself. Because when you get into in-depth Bible study, you find a lot of things where not knowing the language really limits your ability to understand. And I remember after class one day, I had a conversation with Dr. Cutter, the Greek professor there. And I said something to him about I really want to be able to learn the Greek so that I'll be able to answer all the questions about the New Testament. Well, he kind of smiled and he said, well, what you're going to find out is learning the Greek, for every question you answer, you're going to create 2 or 3 more. It doesn't answer all the questions. Well, that was one lesson right there. And then as I got into what it was involved in actually learning Greek, I decided that my initial goal of being a Greek major was ill-conceived at best. It was just really, really hard. Especially for me, the memorizing of the vocabulary. I could understand the concepts of the grammar readily enough. But ever since I was a small boy, I've had trouble with route memorization, whether it's memorizing scripture or parts for a play or the words of a song or the vocabulary in the Greek. That kind of learning has always been very difficult for me. And so I decided that when I counted the cost to me for trying to master Greek was just too high. In the first parable especially is evidence of a strong emphasis on honor and shame in the culture of the ancient Mediterranean world. This is something that the Jewish culture of Jesus' day had in common with the culture of the Arab world in modern times. In much of the world, and certainly in the Middle East and in most of Asia, you're dealing with cultures where shame and honor are the defining issues of life. In the Western world, we focus more on guilt than we do on shame. But shame was a big deal in the world in which Jesus operated. And nobody likes to be made fun of. Nobody likes to be mocked. With all the discussion these days about things like bullying in school, one of the issues that always comes up is when kids are bullied, often the bullying is in the form of ridicule, making fun, shaming. And that's very degrading. But as bad as that is in our culture, it was much worse in the culture in which Jesus lived and operated. And it's much worse in the Arab cultures of the world today. to be shamed is just kind of the ultimate offense in much of the world. So if you set out to build a tower and you find that you didn't calculate the cost right and you've got a half-finished tower on your hands and no funds to finish it, the ridicule that you would have been subjected to, the public scorn would have been a crushing load. I don't know about you, it never occurred to me to set out to build a tower. That's something that most of us never have occasion to do. Closest thing to a tower that most people in Virginia would ever build would be maybe a deer stand in a tree. We don't build a lot of towers in our world. But it was a fairly common thing in the ancient Mideast. And when I had a chance some years ago to travel to Yemen on a couple of different occasions, I saw a modern day counterpart to the towers that were often built in ancient Judea. If you were a farmer and you had a vineyard or some other kind of orchard or cropland, it was common to build a tower so that your guards at night could watch your vineyard or your herds or whatever to prevent theft. And in Yemen, you see towers out there in the countryside that they're typically made out of stone or mud brick, and they serve exactly the same purpose. They're watchtowers for the people who guard the herds. Or in many cases the fields of khat, which is a mild narcotic which has had a devastating impact on the culture of Yemen. And it's a valuable cash crop, and so they have to guard it to keep the thieves out. So a tower would not be an unusual thing for a farmer or a vineyard owner to construct. The point is, if you start out to do something and you can't finish it, it's a terrible embarrassment. By far, the best understanding of these two parables, they are a warning to Jesus' would-be disciples to count the cost of discipleship. One of the questions that scholars ask about these parables and their position here in chapter 14 is, were these found in this specific context originally when Jesus said them, or as Luke was putting his gospel together, did he insert these parables at this point in Jesus' conversation because they were related to what he was talking about? And scholars debate this. And it's not at all clear from the context. Listen, I'm going to read this passage and I'm going to omit the parables. So I'm going to read verses 25 through 27, then we'll skip down to 33. And you can just listen. Don't try to follow along. Just listen as I read and tell me if this sounds like something's missing. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So therefore any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." Now, if you didn't know that those parables were in that passage of Luke, reading that, taking them out, you'd never miss them. You know, the flow of what Jesus is saying is smooth and uninterrupted at this point. Now, that is not to say that Jesus didn't say these parables. It is simply to acknowledge the fact that it is possible that Luke, as he was arranging the material he was working with, chose this place to insert these parables because it flowed well with the context of what Jesus was talking about in this particular time. Remember, Luke says in the very first verses of his gospel that what he has here was the result of his research. He had collected material from various sources as he was trying to craft a story about Jesus' life and ministry. And so it may well be that these two parables were initially said by Jesus in another place or in another context, and Luke inserted them here because they fit well with the topic that Jesus was discussing. We don't know. And ultimately, it really doesn't matter. Because wherever they originally were stated, the context is appropriate, putting them where they are here in Luke's Gospel. In fact, the whole context of what Jesus is saying is a little ambiguous here. It's clearly not terribly important, or we'd have more information about it. What we have here is a statement that the primary obstacles to discipleship and at the same time the primary opportunities for discipleship are our possessions and our family. What we have and the relationships that are closest to us can either be the grounds for a growing and deepening discipleship, or they can be the reasons why our discipleship is lacking. You think about the demands of life. If you have no spouse, no children, no grandchildren, no home to take care of, you don't have all of the work and responsibility that those things entail, then theoretically you have more time and resources that you can devote to the service of God. Paul talks about that, and when he talks about marriage, it's the reason that he states why he chose not to marry. And bear in mind, in the context of that time, for a rabbi to be single was almost unheard of, unless he was a widower. It was the norm, it was the cultural expectation that Jewish men got married, and rabbis in particular. It would be as unusual, if not more unusual, than for a Baptist minister in his 40s to be pastoring a church and never have been married. You don't encounter unmarried ministers unless they're very young or they're old enough that their spouse has died. It just doesn't happen very often. And so that was quite a statement that Paul made, and it was quite a sacrifice that he made. But his rationale was the nature of his work, the demands of his apostleship were such that to be married would have encumbered his ministry. The reality is that anything that demands a lot of your time, whether it is a relationship, a piece of property, a business, whatever, has the potential of hindering your discipleship, or conversely, can be an asset to it. When I think about my own life and ministry, I would never have been nearly as effective as a pastor had I remained single, because I have in Joyce an incredible asset. She's got a set of gifts and abilities that I do not have, that I have learned to rely on. They augment my ministry. But I have known other men in the ministry whose wives were a definite hindrance to their ability to serve effectively. So it depends on the circumstance. It depends on a lot of choices. So Jesus talks about the requirements of discipleship, and when he's, when we read, you've got to hate your mother and your father and all that, don't read that literally. I mean, Jesus is at no place teaches us to hate. Again, this is hyperbole that is said for effect. He's saying, anything that you put before me makes it impossible for you to follow me. And then in these two parables, we see his urging that you seriously contemplate what it is you're getting into when you agree to be Jesus' disciple. The whole passage is arranged to promote discipleship. The unity of the saints again is not real obvious. This could be inserted. But the key word that we see recurring in verse 26, in verse 27, and then again in verse 33 is a word that is translated in the ESV, cannot. In some translations is translated he is not able. And the root word that literally translated is able. This is one of the key themes in this whole passage. What is required for us to be able to follow Jesus effectively as disciples? These parables sound a lot like common sense wisdom. You could almost imagine Solomon including these parables in Proverbs. The parables are clearly intended to warn against a premature and unaware acceptance of discipleship. Know what you're getting into. This is the kind of thing that as parents we frequently end up telling our kids. Think about what you're doing here. This decision has consequences. Whether it's your choice of friends or your choice of colleges or your career choices. With age and experience, we can look and we can see the likely outcome of some of the decisions that somebody young and inexperienced may miss. And so it is a common caution. Think this through. Count the cost. Make sure you know what you're getting into. Ask a lot of questions. Now, some scholars read this and they argue that, well, this is kind of odd. I mean, in other places, Jesus is encouraging people to drop everything on the spur of the moment and follow him. They cite things like the scene where Jesus is walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he says to Peter and James and John, drop everything and follow me. He doesn't say anything there about counting the cost. The reality is that even in other places in the Gospels, Jesus does urge reflection on what discipleship means. We see it in Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 through 22, in Luke 9, 57 and following. He has words of caution to would-be followers. Think about when James and John approached him through the auspices of their mother, asking for the seats of prominence when Jesus came into his kingdom. Remember what Jesus said? He asked, are you able? You able to bear the cross that I'm going to bear? Discipleship, as we take all of the Gospels in their entirety, the message that comes through loud and clear, this is no light matter. The urgency of the call does not diminish the seriousness of the commitment. And I got to tell you, for way too much of Baptist history, at least in the last 100 years, we have emphasized the urgency at the cost of neglecting the significance and the solemn importance of that decision to follow Jesus. You know, I have sat through some torturous invitations at the close of worship services where the pastor used every emotional, manipulative trick he could come up with to try to compel decisions. Now, I don't question the motives, at least not in most cases. There is a real concern, a passion for the lost, a concern that somebody neglecting to make a decision today may never again have that opportunity. So, the urgency is real. It is there. But if this decision is not thoughtfully and solemnly entered into, great harm can be done. The point of the parables is clear. Who would begin to build a tower without analyzing whether or not he had the resources to finish the job? Now, while none of us will probably ever build a tower, no. You might build a house, you might build an outbuilding, you might build a garage, you might decide to remodel your kitchen. Anytime that you set out to do anything of that nature, one of the first things you're going to do, unless you've got a lot more resources than I do, is to figure out whether you got the money to finish the job. Or at least the money, the resources to float the loan. Few of us have the luxury of just being able to spend money without having to think about it. You know, I doubt that I will ever be one of those people who can go into a store where there are no price tags on the items for sale, and the understanding is if you have to ask, you can't afford it. Most of us have to ask. Most of us have to do the math before we sign the contract. No king, no general would go into a battle willingly where he had a choice without first deciding whether or not he had the men and the materiel to be victorious. Just as foolish would be any thought of being a disciple of Jesus without assessing the impact on your life. Discipleship changes allegiances within families. It requires, ultimately, the willingness to die. It shifts the focus off of ourselves onto another. It places us at the disposal of another. It changes the way we handle our money. It impacts, ultimately, every area of our life. One theologian put it rather succinctly: salvation may be free, but it is not cheap. It may be free, but it is not cheap. And again, we Baptists often stumble at the focus in this parable on human effort and the implication that insufficient power may be the undoing of our discipleship. Whether you like it or not, that's the underlying assumption in the parable. These parables are about discipleship. Some have observed that the two parables, there's a subtle difference in the emphasis. They go two slightly different directions. In the first one, we're warned against too easy a choice to follow. In the second, a choice not to follow. Put another way, in the first parable, Jesus says, sit down and reckon whether you can afford to follow me. In the second parable, he says, sit down and reckon whether you can afford to refuse my demands. Slight different emphasis. Very close, very similar, but a little colored difference in shading. Some reading these parables have asked the question, is discipleship even possible for all people? One writer said, discipleship's not for everyone, and certainly not possible for everyone. Well, I have a real problem with that. That not all people will be disciples is a given. It doesn't matter how effectively the gospel is communicated, how much love is shown to the person that you're seeking to bring into the kingdom. It doesn't matter ultimately how consistent you are in your witness. When all else is said and done, there still rests with each individual a choice that must be made. And no matter what you and I do, while we can influence that decision-making process, we cannot make the decision for them. And sometimes the heartbreaking reality is the person may be brought right up to the edge and then back away. And that's what we call free will. And the truth is, not even God interferes with our free will. He will try to influence it for sure. He will send his people to get in the way of somebody who seems bent on making the wrong choices. But ultimately the choice has to be made by each individual person. So the fact that not all will choose to be disciples is not the same as saying not all have the ability to be disciples. Now, at this point, I have to deal with a hard reality. We would never say it out loud. We would never even admit it to ourselves. But there is an unwritten assumption in the thinking of way too many Christians. And it seems to be an assumption that many churches just sort of take for granted. And that is the very unbiblical idea that there are two levels of discipleship. That there is the level for the select few. And there's the level for the vast majority of others. Into that select few, we would include pastors and other vocational ministers, missionaries, seminary professors, a handful of other special people who go above and beyond the call, who make following Jesus not just a matter of commitment, their whole life is focused around it. We would include, those people who face martyrdom, even though they're not vocational ministers, because of their commitment. And this small elect group we place on one side, and then there is this huge mass of humanity, the average Christian. And we regard them as operating on a very different level. This practical differentiation between two groups has absolutely no basis in Scripture. It's not there. And we've done a lot of things to reinforce this false notion. You got to remember that for the first several hundred years of Christian history, there was no such thing as vocational ministers. Certainly in first century Christianity, I wouldn't go so far as to say there was none, but there were very, very few. The overwhelming majority of people who served as pastors of churches, as missionaries, did so by supporting their ministry with some other kind of work. Certainly that's how Paul, we've even adopted the term tent maker. He made tents. That's how he funded his ministry. And so we've got a whole category of tent maker ministers now that, the term has come right out of the way Paul supported his work. To be sure, there were those, and Paul said it's perfectly appropriate for ministers to be reimbursed for their labor. But it was never the only model. And for much of Christian history, it was not the primary one. Did you ever wonder why Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian churches are so much more common in the western part of Virginia than they are in the Tidewater? Why the Episcopal churches are far more common in the Tidewater than they are in the western part of the state? Maybe you've never noticed that before. As you go even further west to Kentucky, Alabama, Tennessee, the pattern becomes even more pronounced. There's a reason. As this land was settled, out there on the edge of the frontier, new churches had to be started. And there was very little in the way of hard currency. The people were scattered. The communities were thrown together, if there were communities. Often there was no building for the church to meet in. More than a few Baptist churches were started in taverns. They were closed on Sunday, and so the church used them. The point is, out there on the edge of the frontier, it was the bivocational ministers, the lay preachers, the guys who worked 6 days a week farming, who were available to preach in those little fledgling congregations. Whereas the Episcopalians required that their minister be seminary trained and come with all the qualifications. And, I thank God for my seminary degree. I'm not minimizing it. But in those tough areas right on the edge of the frontier, that simply wasn't an option. And so it would be the Baptists and the Methodists and sometimes the Presbyterians who were coming in there, starting those churches with lay preachers. And it would be sometimes years later before the Episcopalians and the Catholics and the Congregationalists were able to come in and build a building and pay a full-time seminary-trained pastor to serve those churches. The idea that there are two categories of Christians, two categories of disciples, if we take that to heart, that frontier model would not have been a possibility. We couldn't have done it. These parables differ greatly from what has been termed the easy believism that marks so much of American Christianity. Churches urge everyone to believe, to accept Jesus, but they make no demands on people's lives. It's all about getting more and more people to make that membership commitment, to go through that baptistry, and to come out as saved. And frankly, sometimes we soft sell this stuff so much, it's basically a form of marketing. You know, we don't want to put any barrier that might inhibit somebody from saying, yeah, I'm willing to become a Christian. You know, it's as if we were selling used cars. We're not trying to help people to change their lives fundamentally. When you minimize the demands of discipleship, you create all kinds of problems for the individuals, for the churches that they are part of, for the societies in which they live. And the ultimate problem is such, quote, Christians, unquote, live lives so like the unbelievers around them that it's impossible to distinguish. And so it is the death of evangelism, because it is in the contrast between the lives that we led before we became Christians and the lives we lead after we become Christians that draws the attention of those around us who the Holy Spirit is working on and can ultimately lead to their conversion. So if you're an unbeliever and you're considering becoming a Christian, how do you count the cost? It's difficult. It's difficult because none of us coming to faith have any idea of the future sacrifices that decision may require of us. To say Jesus is Lord is not the same as saying Jesus is Lord unless. Faith in Christ, worthy of the name of necessity, means discipleship regardless of the consequences. We are giving over our lives into the hands of another. These parables are about more than considering the cost of discipleship. More significant is the fact that discipleship requires intent, choice, determination, and effort. It is not some half-hearted, light-headed affair, and it's not something that just happens. Discipleship occurs only with effort, and not just human effort. Discipleship is not about our straining to excel to be the best we can. It is a life commitment to Jesus. It is submitting ourselves to the control of the indwelling Holy Spirit. Honor and shame are more implied than spelled out in our culture. But we still have huge expectations of what gives us or denies us respectability. Doesn't matter if we're talking about the world of academia, or church life, or family life, or whatever area of life you want to look at. And the fact of the matter is, choosing to be a disciple of Jesus may cost you the respect of others in those circles in which you operate, some of which are very important to you. You know, thankfully we live in a land where overt persecution is all but unheard of, but there's lots of ways to embarrass and ridicule and demean people because of their beliefs. You know, we're not exempt from that. You know, we make fun of Jehovah's Witnesses. We make fun of Scientologists. You know, we have the various groups that we, if not overtly, at least quietly to ourselves, ridicule. And as Christians who make life commitments to follow Jesus, we open ourselves to that same kind of ridicule. And it can have a huge impact on our willingness to stand out as a Christian. I remember when I was a sophomore in high school. Bear in mind that I surrendered to the ministry when I was in the 8th grade. I preached my first sermon as a freshman in high school, after which my parents sold our house in the suburbs, bought a farm about 80 miles south of St. Louis, about 7 miles from where Joyce grew up. Now I started high school knowing that I was preparing to go into full-time Christian ministry. And I still have on my shelf in my study the little Good News for Modern Man New Testament that I read every day back then. And if you will ask Joyce of her very first memories of me, long before we started dating, she will say, yeah, he was the guy that carried a Bible into the study hall. Set me out as a little strange. I mean, I was strange in enough other ways it really didn't matter, I guess. But, those are the kinds of choices that can come back to haunt us. It's called the price of discipleship, counting the cost. Next week, we will begin a study of the Gospel of John. 21 chapters. To do it any justice at all, I had to be willing to commit an hour for each one of those chapters. So it's going to take us the better part of 6 months to get through John's Gospel. But if there's any book in the Bible worthy of committing 6 months of study to, it's the Gospel of John. I have said before, if I had to limit my Bible to just 3 or 4 books, John's Gospel would definitely be one of them. It is a wonderful book. And if you've never done a really good study of that Gospel, then you're in for a treat, because this is rich, rich stuff. Some of the most powerful images in all the Bible are in that Gospel. So we'll be starting next Wednesday. You will note that the last Wednesday of September, I'm taking a couple of days of vacation, and so there will not be a Bible study that night. The only other times that we're not going to have them are around the holidays, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the Wednesday just before Christmas Eve, and the Wednesday before New Year's Eve. But otherwise, weather permitting, we will continue through and should wrap the study up at the end of February.